So let's imagine you've got your exams coming up in the next weeks or months. It's time for everyone's favourite part of revision, creating a sparkly new revision timetable. So you've decided Monday is going to be devoted to psychology, starting with paper 1, so social influence first. Tuesday will be memory, Wednesday attachment, Thursday psychopathology. Friday you've decided you'll start paper 2 with the approaches, Saturday biopsychology, Sunday have a rest, and then Monday crack on with research methods. Sounds good, right? However, as good and as colour coordinated as this plan might be, it's missing a psychological trick that can take the effectiveness of your revision to a whole other level. Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. So, what's wrong with this revision timetable? It reflects what some psychologists call massed practice, which is okay, it's not terrible, it's just that there is something even better, something called spaced repetition. Most people know that if you're trying to learn something, simply studying it once won't do the trick. It won't stay in your memory for the long term, so we study it again. But what fewer people know is that the timing of when you practice matters a great deal. Massed practice is when you repeatedly study the same information in one study session. In contrast, spaced repetition is when you repeatedly study the same information, but it is spaced out over time. There are intervals or time gaps between each study session. But does spaced repetition actually work? What's the psychological evidence behind it? Consider this study from 2011 to see the impact spaced repetition can make on your own learning. 4 groups of students were presented with some word pairs to learn, and they were shown a Swahili word with its English translation below it and were told to study the pair so that they could remember the English word when given the Swahili word. Group 1 studied the words once and then were tested. This was how much they remembered. No surprises here that they didn't do particularly well, given there was a lack of active recall. Group 2 were given the word pairs to study, and then they had to recall the word list and then were tested. Here's how they did, notably better. Further evidence for the importance of active recall in your revision. But now here's where things got interesting. Group 3 did massed practice. This was where they studied the words, but when they recalled the word pairs, they recalled one word pair multiple times before moving on to the next word pair. There was no spacing between testing themselves. And here's how they did when tested. Interestingly, not much difference. But group 4 is where we see the lesson for this video. In contrast to group 3, who had no spacing between testing themselves, in group 4 they studied the word pairs and then recalled them, but rather than repeating their recall of the word pair again and again, they spaced out their repetition of recall. There was some time, some space between when they recalled the first time and when they recalled again. This is how they did. Now just pause for a moment and really grasp what this study is showing you. Group 3 and Group 4 did exactly the same amount of work, studied for exactly the same amount of time, but got incredibly different scores on the results. No more effort, no more time studying, but an almost 50% improvement in performance. Why? Because they spaced out their recall. They tested themselves multiple times, but spaced it out rather than doing it all in one go. The evidence is so strong that one review stated that the benefits of spaced practice to learning are arguably one of the strongest contributions that cognitive psychology has made to education. So why does spaced repetition work? Well, this brings us to the forgetting curve proposed by German psychologist Hans Ebbinghaus, which shows the way that learned information fades over time. When we first learn something, our memory can be quite strong, depending on how we studied and learned the material, especially if we do active recall. But over time, the strength of that memory fades. Ebbinghaus's important discovery was that by reviewing new information at key moments on the forgetting curve, you can reduce the rate at which you forget it. For example, if you're revising ways of studying the brain and are trying to remember how postmortems, fMRIs, EEGs and ERPs work, you've forgotten nearly half the content by the following day. And by the time a week's gone by, well...
I don't know, sir.
Pity.
But we can use our knowledge of the forgetting curve to our advantage. What we want to do is interrupt this forgetting by studying the material again through active recall. The key is to allow enough time to have passed so that it's become a little harder to remember. This is because, as we saw in the previous video on active recall, the harder we have to work to retrieve the information, the more we strengthen the connections in our brain and the easier it becomes in the future to recall it. Students can sometimes find this scary and want to avoid finding out what they don't know, and can take it as a bad sign that they couldn't easily recall previously studied material, particularly when they thought they knew that topic really well. It can be discouraging, but this is exactly what should be happening and is perfectly normal. And it's the very fact of it being difficult to recall that strengthens the memory. So once you've revised the 4 ways of studying the brain, review your understanding again the next day. It doesn't have to take you very long. It could be as simple as grabbing a blank piece of paper and writing down as much as you can remember about how each one works, and then recall it a few days later, and then in a week, and so on. Let's now come back to our original colour-coordinated revision timetable and make some changes to now make the most of spaced repetition. We're going to do this in 2 ways. Firstly, by zooming out and looking at it week by week and day by day, and then secondly, we'll zoom in and explore what spaced repetition might look like in each study session. So firstly, zoom out. Originally, the revision timetable looked like this, with each topic to be studied placed on an individual day. To gain the benefits of spaced repetition, what we could do is study social influence not just on Monday, but on Wednesday and Saturday, and then schedule to go back to it a week later the following Saturday. And the same for memory. For attachment, we might study that on Tuesday, Thursday and Sunday, and then schedule to come back to it a week later on the following Sunday. And the same for psychopathology. Now, I think it's important at this point to remind you what you should be doing in the study sessions you've scheduled for each day. You're not studying the topic for the first time to try to understand it. You're not making mind maps and flashcards and writing out notes. This is stuff that you should already have done ahead of time before you start revising. Understanding the material, making flashcards and summaries is what you do to prepare for revision, not actually studying effectively. What you should be doing in each of these study sessions is active recall. Pick any of the 4 active recall strategies I explained in the previous video. Testing yourself doesn't have to take long at all. For example, grab another piece of blank paper. Can you recall the main categories and subcategories for social influence? And then can you add another layer with further detail? And do all of this without your notes. Then check to see how much you got right by looking at your notes, a textbook, or a complete guide for a topic like these ones for biopsychology and attachment. In your next study session, you might use flashcards, and in the session after that, past exam questions. So firstly, zoom out and space out your study sessions over time, making sure you use active recall study techniques in each session. Secondly though, let's zoom in. We can also use spaced repetition within the study sessions themselves. If we are studying social influence, we can break up our study of that topic into different parts and repeatedly test ourselves on those areas. For example, social influence can be broken down into 3 parts: conformity, obedience, and resistance. So what you could do is test yourself on conformity first, then test yourself on obedience, but then come back to do a quick bit of active recall on conformity again before going on to resistance. Then when you've done resistance, you could come back to obedience again and do a quick test to see what you can remember, and then do resistance again to finish. A really helpful piece of advice at this point is to have some way of tracking your revision, of tracking how you do when you test yourself, so you can see which areas you know and are stronger at, and which areas you know less well and thus need to spend more time on. If on Monday you were completely blank in trying to explain the authoritarian personality, you might prioritize this in your next revision session on Wednesday and test yourself more often on it. I've made a document to help you with this called the revision tracker, which is linked in the description. This contains a whole list of questions on the topic that you can use to test yourself, and then columns on the right to record the date you tested yourself, and a space for you to record how well you recalled it: red for not at all, amber for somewhat, and green for 100% correct. Now at this point you might be thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was some sort of app that could help do this for me? Well actually there are. Quizlet and Anki are both flashcard apps that make use of spaced repetition so that you can revisit the topics you need to more often in your study session. They present you with a flashcard for you to test yourself with, and then when it reveals the answer, you rate how well you've answered it. The algorithm then shapes how often the same flashcard is presented to you, more often if you got it wrong and less frequently if you got it right. Personally, I would use Anki and I've had many students have great success with it, but you find what works for you. For more resources to help you with your psychology revision, check out the links in the description below, and for videos on the biopsychology topic you can click the playlist on the screen now. I hope you found this video helpful and we'll see you in the next one.